Hello students, my name is Gaurav Bansal and we are going to start this new topic, the impact of services on Indian economy or the importance of services for Indian economy. Now, services sector is one of the most important factor or contributor of the growth behind India. Yet, there has been some controversy regarding services. So, we'll pick up those points and we will try to identify the issues on which direct questions or let us say interdisciplinary questions are expected. So, contribution of services. Direct question on contribution of services will not come. Okay. But even if a question come on issues related to services, you have to talk about it. So contribution of services has to be covered anyhow. Then we need to talk about services and sustainable development. Services and inclusive growth. Services and job creation. Okay, these are the different possible questions. I can almost assure you, if a question is going to be asked on the service sector as a whole, it is always going to be asked in the context of either sustainable development, inclusive growth, or job creation. Job creation is likely to be the most important perspective. Okay, so these are the points that we are going to talk about. And you talk about any of them, you have to first talk about contribution of services also. Then only you can go into that. So now let us deal with that. First we talk about services and sustainable development. Now sustainability is not just environmental, that whether our environment will continue to be same, whether we will damage our environment, whether our future production capability will be same or not. Those are the challenges we talk about in the environmental perspective, that whether an environment will be same or not, whether we will have same production capacity or not. But in economy, there is one more dimension that we talk about in addition to those environmental concerns, and that is how sustainable is growth and development from one sector. Can we rely on it? Can we rely on it? Would services continue to give us growth? Would services continue to give growth? These type of questions definitely can be asked. Okay, and we need to approach services from that perspective. So, can we rely on it? So, on what basis can we argue whether we can rely on services or not? The point is, services still has a lot of potential to grow. Although services have already become big thing in India, yet they have a big potential. Why? Because services grow with urbanization, financial inclusion, infrastructure development. Now, India is a country that is not yet fully urbanized. It will continue to urbanize for the next 50 years. It is a country where financial inclusion, although has improved, is not yet achieved. It will continue to happen for next 2-3 decades also. It is a country where infrastructure still has a big gap. It will continue to develop. So, since that is going to happen, services are also going to grow. So, services are going to grow or will not saturate until the urbanization is going to increase in India. And hence we can see a very long growth pattern and expectation from services. So yes, we can definitely rely on it. Okay. So, but you have to present in this argument that if such question is asked, then you have to go like this, that services grow with all of these factors. And then you have to talk about how we are improving in all these three. And hence, we can expect services to grow continuously in the coming time. Services are still restricted largely to our urban areas, cities. In small towns, villages, the share of services in the GDP is still much slower, the regional GDP. It's not slower, sorry, much lower. So that is why we can argue. Okay, would services continue to give growth is the same thing. Okay, so yes, services can give us growth for a considerable amount of time. So yes, services can give us a sustainable growth. Now about sustainable development or environmental concern. So services have, it has much lower carbon footprint. Okay, per rupee revenue generated. Okay, so if industry generate 1 crore rupees of output, whereas agriculture generate 1 crore rupees of output and services generate 1 crore rupees of output, you will identify that, for example, if industry generate 70 ton carbon in the process, agriculture generate 50 ton carbon in the process. Okay, let us say services would release only about 20 ton carbon in the process. So from environmental perspective also, services do have a benefit. Then once you talk about carbon footprint, then you also talk about the next point, that now gig economy, online work, okay, distance jobs, work from home, etc., is increasing rapidly. Okay. Gig economy, work from home. Okay, this is another criteria that we need to consider. Okay, carbon footprint, then this, and because of this, people are able to work from their home. This reduces the need for transport, pressure on transport, and also further the carbon emissions. Even from environmental perspective, services has many advantages. Clear? So those are some of the major points from the sustainable development perspective. What are the disadvantages? So you can consider that there are many carbon emissions which may not be directly visible. For example, maintenance of data servers. Okay, so they provide support to, the services sector. Okay, but that carbon emission may not be visible immediately. For example, American companies provide cloud computing support to Indian businesses. Indian services sector get benefit from them. But carbon emission would be at data centers in USA, not in India. So it might not be immediately visible in India, but yes, there might be carbon footprint elsewhere. However, when we consider it overall, still it is lower than industry or agriculture. So that is the point. Now that is all about the sustainable development. Services and sustainable development, these are the perspectives that we need to consider. Now we talk about services and inclusive growth. Rather, it is better if we talk about job creation, because inclusive growth would rather be expansion of that point. Let us talk about job creation first. So there is a debate regarding jobless growth. Okay, it is argued that since Indian economy was dependent on services, it had jobless growth. Okay, so how true is that? We need to identify. We need to consider. How true is that allegation? So first of all, you provide data or you provide the perspective. So you need to write that per rupee out for per rupee output, services generate less jobs. For each rupee of output, services generate less jobs compared to agriculture and industry. Okay, so yes, there is this challenge that for each rupee of output, there is less jobs. So, for example, for 1 crore rupee of output, while industry will generate, let us say, about 30 jobs. Let us say on average, 30 jobs. Agriculture for 1 crore rupees worth of output would generate 50 jobs, let us say. Services, on the other hand, might generate only about 20 jobs or 15 jobs, let us say. So, services generate less jobs for each rupee worth of output. So, yes, there is some truth to this allegation. Clear? However, then you have to counter this allegation by two major points. What are those two major points? Then you have to talk about point number one, right? However, we must also consider that there are sectors like tourism. There are sectors like logistics. There are sectors like teaching or education, warehousing. All these sectors are very labor intensive. Okay. Machinery doesn't provide the tourism services. Machinery doesn't provide much of logistic services. Machinery has a role to play in logistics, but manpower or the labor power is also equally important. Teaching also, it is labor intensive. Warehousing is also fairly labor intensive. It may not be as labor intensive as others, but it is also fairly labor intensive. So there are many sectors which generate decent amount of jobs, significant jobs. So we have areas in services which generate jobs. Generally, okay, then you talk about it. That generally we think about banking services, IT, when we talk about services. Generally, we think about banking, IT, when we talk about services. However, they are just mere component of services. There are many more services which are labor intensive, and hence services can generate fair amount of jobs. This is what you need to argue here. So this would be a good counterpoint and will also provide a good anchor and balance to the answer. Okay, so this you need to talk about in the job creation. I hope that point is clear to you. Okay. Then after this, you need to talk about that also there is some misinterpretation. Also there is some misinterpretation. It is not the problem of less jobs per rupee output. Okay. I hope you're writing. Okay. You can take down notes. It will really help you develop your long-term memory. So when you just listen, you retain only 25% of it. But when you write along with listening, you retain about 70% of it. Let us say on average. Now I'm coming back to it, that we said in the beginning, for each rupee of output, services generate less jobs. However, this is also a misinterpretation. We need to understand that rather than looking at this as each they generate less job per rupee, we need to identify that they generate more rupee per worker. It is a different perspective on the same thing. They generate more rupee per person. There is higher productivity. Okay. For example, instead of talking about the population explosion, population burden, we now talk about demographic dividend. We look at it as an opportunity. That is how we should approach here also. You got my point? This will give you very good positive perspective towards the end, that you are solution oriented. You look for opportunities. So what you should be writing towards the end here, that rather than looking at it as less jobs for each rupee output, we should look at it as more output per worker, and hence services has been able to provide good living standard to the workers in the sector. You take it into human rights, labor welfare, and then it will suddenly look good. Okay. Agriculture ज़्यादा job देता है. Agriculture creates more jobs, but what is the condition of those laborers? Very bad. Do we want same? No, it is other way around. The solution is other way around. We should approach it in a different way. Okay, so for example, I will give you an. Uh, we talk about Sachin Tendulkar. Those who follow cricket may be able to understand. Okay, so for example, those who have grown up in the 90s, in the 1990s, Indian cricket team always had this problem, and we always used to talk about that our team is dependent on Tendulkar. Our team is dependent on Tendulkar. This was said so many times that Indian team dependent on Tendulkar as if it is a problem of Tendulkar. Okay, as if it is a problem of Tendulkar, because we are talking about problem of Indian team, but we mention Tendulkar here. That Indian team is over dependent on Tendulkar. It is the problem of other players. They are not, let us say, consistent enough. So before the arrival of Rahul Dravid, Saurav Ganguly, until they were well established into team, there was always this problem. No other player was that much consistent or reliable. So there was always this problem. Team was dependent on one person, but that was not problem of Tendulkar. That was problem of others. We unfairly would blame Tendulkar for that. Just like that, services generate much more output per person, and then we say that you generate less job per output. It is a wrong kind of criticism. Rather, we need to generate more output for each worker in other industries also. That is what we need to. Then suddenly this problem may not be same. It will look very different. So yes, services can create jobs. There are sector in services which create number of jobs, adequate number of jobs. Okay, and services do generate more output per worker. So it is not a problem of jobless growth as such, but yes, we need to create more jobs. Our population is more, our working age population increased rapidly. So at one point of time, we faced these problems. But as population will stabilize, as our fertility rates have gone down and working age group will stabilize, then suddenly we will find these type of problems may not be there. Okay, the problem is that services is not able to catch up with the need for the jobs. Our need for job is too huge, and there should always be balance between the three sectors. So those are the problems. It is not just the problem of services. So sometimes they get unfairly blamed for. So that is it. You can easily tackle the question of job creation and have a positive perspective about it. Now the last part, services and inclusive growth. Okay, so what is that? Services and inclusive growth means, or this is a question about whether services have urban bias. Okay, which they have, means services create rural urban divide. Okay, so that is a question from the perspective of inclusive growth. Do they create male female worker divide? Do they create regional divide? Okay. So these are the perspectives that we need to look forward to in inclusive growth. So now when we suddenly look for these perspectives, we will look at services in a very different light. Okay. Also, let us say unskilled labor. Do services create a difference between skilled versus unskilled? Okay. Skilled versus unskilled. Do services create these kind of divides in society? Or are services able to include everyone in the growth process? Are they able to take unskilled workers together? Are they able to take rural areas together? Are they able to take all females together or backward regions together? So we will have to analyze on this. Now let us talk about it. So there are some genuine criticism here. Services have a very definite urban bias. And yes, if our growth is dependent significantly on rural services, then there would be lack of development in rural areas. There we do not balance it. We cannot balance it and we should not try that. We have a definite criticism, clear criticism. So you have to talk about it. Clear? So services do have an urban bias. However, even this urban bias can reduce with improvement of infrastructure in rural areas. Okay, so they do have urban bias, and there is no if and but about it. But this can reduce, okay, we can still reduce it by improving infrastructure in rural areas, by having financial inclusion. Okay, so this urban bias can be reduced by infrastructure, then financial inclusion, income growth. Okay, if these are there, then services would reach even rural areas. Okay, in fact, those areas will not retain their rural character. Even those areas would tend to be different. Okay, so basically, more urbanization is the solution to this. This is a problem in a way. Now we talk about the next male-female divide. So it is other way around. Services is more easily accessible for women. Okay, so services promote inclusive growth as there is more easy access for women. Hazardous work is not there. Working conditions are not physically very challenging. Timings are not, in many professions, timings are also suitable. Okay, so all of that is changing rather. And then we come back to the point that I think I've rubbed it. Anyways, we come back to the point that there is evolution of gig economy, part-time work, work from home, and this is more in services sector. In manufacturing, you cannot work from home. In agriculture, you definitely cannot work from home. Okay, I think all of you understand that. Agriculture, आप घर में बैठ के तो सब्जी नहीं लगा सकते. So in agriculture, you cannot work from home. In industry, you cannot work from home. In most of the cases, it is in services where this is possible. Work from home, gig working, etc. In much more cases. And this give lot of women more flexibility who otherwise are not able to work in a full-time rigorous job. Some women, okay, who have children and they need to take care of them, small children, and they can work from home or they can work for 4-hour shifts when their children go to school, or 6-hour shift when their children go to school. Such women can find work now, otherwise they had to opt out from workforce. So it is rather contributing to inclusive growth, definitely. So services benefits inclusive growth from this perspective. Similarly, services provide more opportunities for differently or specially able. Differently or specially able. Okay. Again, for the same reason, lack of, it's not a very hazardous work from home options are more accessible. Okay, usually desk jobs. That is why even physically specially able people, differently abled people, they can also work easily in this sector. So that is also the. Then we talk about skilled versus unskilled, skilled versus unskilled divide. Are services increasing that type of divide? So if we analyze this, then we have to it is alleged that services do not provide jobs to unskilled workers, but even that is not 100% correct. There is some element of truth in that, but there are many sectors like tourism, logistics, warehousing. Okay, teaching is definitely not one of them, but tourism, logistics, warehousing, these type of sector do employ large number of unskilled, semi-skilled, lesser educated people also. Okay, so that is also there. So it is not necessary that they can only provide job to skilled workers and not unskilled workers. This perspective also we definitely clear. So this also we have here. So it can provide jobs to unskilled, but yes, there is a challenge. Typically, the jobs that are there for unskilled workers, they do not pay so well. So that is true. Okay, so for example, security guards, they provide service, but they do not get paid well. Drivers, okay, who work in the logistics, they do not get paid well. Crane operators and other people who work in warehousing, etc., they also do not get paid very well. Okay. Tourism, people do get paid well in general, but still not as well as their skilled counterparts. So this problem is in every single sector. Unskilled labor always get paid less, whether it is agriculture, whether it is industry. So of course, someone who is skilled, someone who is experienced is going to work, earn more. So that we cannot counter against, but services do provide jobs for unskilled, although that is not good enough. Okay, hence we need to promote those sectors which create jobs in rural areas as well as provide jobs to unskilled workers. For example, sectors like these. Okay, and there are many more sectors like these, even within the services. So that is there. Now the last point is whether services create a regional divide. So the answer is services do not necessarily create regional divide, but services tend to go to those states, okay, which have better infrastructure, law and order. Services tend to go to those states which have better infrastructure, law and order, and availability of skilled labor force. Okay, since southern state focused much more on human capital, the growth of services was more in southern states. Okay, cities like Pune, Chennai, Bangalore, Hyderabad emerged as major centers for services. So services tend to favor those states where human capital is better. So of course other states need to catch up on this. It is not something for which services should be blamed. This is not a gap which other states cannot cover. Rather, availability of raw material is a gap which you cannot cover. It is a geographical gap. Okay. For example, steel industry will not be established in Haryana because steel is an industry which should be located close to raw material. So it will always be in Jharkhand, West Bengal, parts of Chhattisgarh or Bihar, etc. That Chota Nagpur plateau region. It will be there. So rather, those sectors have challenge. It is not services in a way. So wherever there is a gap, that gap can be easily covered. It is not a gap that cannot be covered. Hence, we should not be unnecessarily criticizing services for it. Services favor the states which focus on their human capital, on their physical infrastructure, law and order reforms, etc. where power supply is good. So all of that matters. And that is all we have to cover on services. Okay. Because if you look at the nature of questions in the past few years, question on inclusive growth, sustainability, etc. have been asked almost every single year. And they typically interlink one of these issues with something else. And there is a good enough chance they can interlink these with services. Otherwise, direct question on services has not come. There was a question, I think, around 2010 or 9, but since then we have not seen direct questions on services. So it will always be, or most likely to be, an question where services is linked with something else. And when I've explained all of this, I've discussed contribution of services, that there are sectors which contribute jobs. Services has provided better living standard to its workers. Okay, that is why everybody wants to work in services. Similarly, services has led to growth of certain areas. So all those contributions have been covered when I was debating on all of these. So this, I think, gives you a very good overview on the overall importance and contribution of services in the Indian economy. So we cannot undermine the contribution of services. They have a great contribution to Indian economy. Okay. It is that the other sectors have been underperforming, and we expect too much from services, that not only they will give us growth, they also give us jobs. We were expecting everything from services. It is rather that problem also. Yes, services can also improve in their contribution. For that, we need to follow on certain policies. Promotion of those sectors, particularly which provide more jobs, and that is what we are doing also. Tourism, logistics, warehousing have been focus sectors of government. So government is working on those things. So with this, we conclude this session. I hope it has been very helpful for you. Thank you.